Hello everyone, today we are going to discuss about big data file formats, performance evaluation, and how you can save money using a specific file format or a combination of file formats. Most of the companies who are moving to cloud environment means you have to consider a fact that when you are using your own data center, you are not a tenant. When you are using a cloud, you are a tenant. So anything that you use, whether it is network, IO, processing or CPU, you have to pay for it. Now our goal is how we can minimize the bill. That's the goal. Okay, and we are going to look at very simple aspects. I know means when we talk about architecture, we talk about services and how those services will be integrated, but somewhere along the lines these basic concepts are forgotten or missed, and we end up paying higher bills. And that's one of the reason why I thought to come up with this presentation, so that most of my customers or those who are subscriber of this channel, they can also look at their environment and figure out, okay, yes, this is applicable, and take uh, an optimal approach in order to optimize the storage plus processing and save cost as well. So let's get into it. So number one, before we get into the file formats, these are basic concept that I want you to be aware, because these are the fundamental building blocks of different types of file formats. So you must have heard about vertical partitioning, horizontal partitioning. You can read about projection push down and predicate push down, because this is how these file formats access data. And if you are coming from a database background, you must have read somewhere in the beginning of your career about how this works. And when you are writing a SQL statement, SQL certain number of columns, and then you provide where clause. So at a very basic level, predicate push down is nothing but a where clause. Projection push down is nothing but all the columns that you are using in your select statement. And then what you are getting in the end is actually the outcome of the query. But what is happening at the vertical partitioning and horizontal partitioning means how they work together in order to give you the optimal results in terms of resource utilization. And that's the goal. So the goal is to optimize traffic, IO, and processing time. Now you now you can read more about vertical partitioning and horizontal partitioning and different ways of doing it, but I'm not going to cover here because our focus is file formats. So now we are going to talk about four different file formats. One is CSV, which is a text file format, and JSON, which is basically JavaScript object notation, in which you represent data in a key value pair in a partially structured format. PARQUET is a highly compressed columnar format, and then it's actually in the binary form. And then AVRO is basically a row based format. So now I have covered four different types of format. Now there are more like ORC and some other, but I guess if we talk four different formats, the rest of them fall into one or other category. Okay, so once we test these file formats, you can get a basic level idea how to do that, and then you can take a similar approach and test other formats as well. So now if we look at the different file formats like JSON, CSV, AVRO, and PARQUET. First of all, we need to understand the properties, because every file format, whether it is CSV, JSON, and so on and so forth, they have a specific properties. So for instance, compressible, whether these files are compressible or not, splittable, readable, whether they support complex data structure. For instance, when we are talking about complex data structure, CSV file does not support complex data structure. JSON, PARQUET, AVRO, they support it. Schema evolution, this is a very important point. CSV and JSON, they don't support schema evolution, but PARQUET and AVRO. So you may need to understand the file properties especially columnar, compressible, splittable, readable, complex data structure, and schema evaluation. So these 6 different properties that I have considered in order to figure out which format is good in which type of environment. So this is very basic, means if your enterprise is using like 10 different or 5 different environments and you have a mix of it, then you need to see what are the different properties, because these properties are actually associated with the use case that you are trying to achieve, because these are the file properties, but at the end of the day you have a specific use case in terms of what sort of queries are being submitted, what sort of operation is happening, and that is going to help you understand what type of format are you going to use. Okay, now when we are talking about performance test environment, I wanted somebody in my team to do this, but when they were looking for these tests, they found this good website luminous.com, and somebody already did it, so we thought why not using the same performance test and explain the concept, because our goal was to explain the concept using a performance test so that everybody gets some idea at some level, so they can go back to their environment and do or apply similar concepts in order to make sure that they are achieving the optimal results. So this, first of all, I would like to thank you to this website luminous.com for doing this experiment. And what they have used is they have used Netflix data set where 3 columns and a lot of rows. It was run on laptop. They used PySpark 2.4.3. The experiments were done 3 times for each format, and then average was taken for each run. All the scripts are located on GitHub. If you want to access, you can go to this location on GitHub and access those files. Okay, now let's go and talk about performance test. Now, space utilization per format. So what we have done is we have picked up different criteria. So space utilization is one of the use case, which is the main function of any file, is to store data. So when we are talking about big data, it is necessary to store large volumes of different types of data types for different purposes. Now, how much this data takes up space will be easily converted into money they will cost. So now just imagine, so if you are using X space, you will have to pay some Y amount, which is directly proportional to the amount you are using and the cost you are paying to your cloud vendor. Now doing the test, we realized that the amount of space that JSON format utilizes is huge. Means it's right in front of you. You can see that given the test environment, how different file formats are using the data set that I just explained. So CSV, JSON, AVRO, and PARQUET. Now note that the entire default configuration was used and compression was not used anywhere. And yeah, means you can configure gzip and so on and so forth, but it was a basic vanilla test. Just okay, plain simple data set. If we just store it in these simple it's very basic simple, that if we store it in these 4 formats, how does it look like? Okay, so you can see, means size MB, means the same data is stored in 4 different formats, and how much space in MB each one is consuming. Okay, now definitely JSON is not the winner, means PARQUET is the winner in this case. Now the next one is ingestion latency. So when we are talking about data engineering and machine learning or ETL, we take data from source and ingest it, or we take raw data or raw file formats and consume it and transform it. So now when we are talking about ingestion latency, you can see that the difference is not huge, but still because CSV is a very simple format, so the latency is very latency is small. I would say latency is minimal compared to the other formats when we talk about or when we discuss about ingesting a simple CSV file compared to PARQUET file. I know, means if you are talking about terabyte of data, you might see different numbers in this graph, but for the simple representation from this representation standpoint, it's very clear that CSV is the winner here. So it is very clear that plain text will be easier to write than encoding and gathering metadata for complex formats such as AVRO and PARQUET. Now let's look at random data lookup latency per format. So in this case, what is happening? So you are firing some random select statements and there is one record that you are trying to access. Now the data is same. Now you are trying to access from CSV, JSON, AVRO and PARQUET. Now how long it takes for data to show up? So you can see that PARQUET is the winner here. Now this is how you need to put down these numbers in a matrix in your environment and run multiple tests, multiple locations or multiple regions if you have like cloud implementations at different regions in order to evaluate the performance, because in region A you might be having certain set of users who are using certain set of queries or batch statements which may not be the same as you have in other region or other part of the world. So that's going to help you build up a strong I would say an approach and method that how are you going to go about it in terms of optimizing the storage, time and processing, and which format is best suited for which region or for which business unit. Because I'm not saying that one is better than other, but it really depends upon what are your use cases in your organization, because I understand there are different types of users in different departments, and that's how you need to look at this. You need to put those numbers in an Excel spreadsheet or whatever format you use, and then you can take it to your boss or to your director or any other person and then show them that if we do this much money we can save by implementing this kind of file formats at different locations. Okay. Basic statistics per format. So for instance, if you are performing min, max, count sort of operations, so what sort of file format is better when you are doing this? So now here we see when we are performing simple statistical operations like min, max, count and so on and so forth, the performance is better using AVRO and PARQUET. CSV is okay, but I guess if we talk about terabytes of data that we are trying to access, I'm sure the results will be very different, because here it is showing 10 seconds, but it will be very high because our data set is very small. Now processing data per format. So now here what we are talking about, so this test is using time column filtering function in order to test the processing data latency per format. So even in this case you can see that the PARQUET is the winner, because you have to understand that that every format means they are designed to handle certain type of data types, and some of them are like their coverage is huge, means they are optimized for a lot of data types, and they can handle and work faster. Grouping by column per format. Now if your organization or business unit is submitting queries which are group by, means I know, means if we are talking about a lot of complex SQL statements or PLSQL statements. It's kind of everywhere, but when you evaluate, when you do a performance evaluation, you come up with a certain key indicators where you get to see that group by is overriding. So in those cases you can look at, okay, what makes more sense. Again, I would say the same thing. CSV looks better here in this case, but if you are talking about a huge amount of data, the numbers will be very different. But obviously AVRO and PARQUET format, they both are winner. Now when we are talking about distinct values, means everybody who has worked on a DBMS, irrespective of the vendor, they know what do I mean by distinct values, right? So now when you are firing distinct statements, how these results look like, means you see PARQUET again performs much better than any other file format when your query or query statements consist of distinct, or the focus is to get distinct values. Now what are the takeaways from this test? And I guess this is a very important point, because you looked at different types of queries submitted, and then there was an outcome specific to each file format, and now you go back and do the similar test, and then you need to write down the takeaways for your test, and that will be the solution that you need to implement in order to optimize the cost, storage, and time for your environment. Now one thing is very clear, that JSON format is good for communication purposes. So for instance, APIs and websites communicate constantly with the JSON format, so that's great. Other than that, I don't think JSON is a good format when it comes to big data or data is at scale. PARQUET and AVRO are definitely more optimized for the needs of big data because of their splittability, compression, their support for complex data structures, but readability and writing speed are not so good. Now when choosing a data storage format in big data environment, you need to consider many factors such as integration with third-party application, the evolution of a schema. I covered evolution of a schema in my second slide, and the support for specific data types. But if you put a performance in the first place, the above tests prove every time convincingly that PARQUET is your best choice when it comes to big data file formats, okay, or big data systems. So I gave you three specific points: integration with a third-party application, evolution of a schema, and support for specific data types, okay. Apache AVRO is a good universal encoder for structured data with the different or with efficient serialization and deserialization. This format guarantees very good performance with all the attributes of a records that are accessed at the same time. So AVRO is good when you are extracting rows at the same time, like multiple rows. It is more of a horizontal partition. So for instance, if you are writing a select statement rather than columnar, your users are using more row based structure or fetching lot of rows. This makes lot of sense. CSV should typically be the fastest to write, JSON the easiest to understand for humans. So yeah, this is also one of the questions, because most of the times you save files and then somebody wants to read it. So when it comes to the readability of file, when I say readability of file, does not mean that how file as its internal data structure reads, but whether you can open and read the file. So for instance, if it is a CSV format, you can right click and open it and see it. Same with the JSON. but you can't do that for Parquet and AVRO because those are the binary format. Okay. Now, so what do we conclude here? That I have covered in a super tip. So for instance, when you are designing a big data environment, when you have to cover all the columns first, and then you, because it does, so the way it happens, you need to bring all the raw data at one place, and then you process it, and then you transform it, process it, and then people come and submit their queries. Now the thing is, now where do we need to use wisdom to choose the file format? So AVRO is usually good to store raw data because all fields are included at the time of ingestion. So if you have similar type of environment where you have to include all the fields, use AVRO. And then Parquet for pre-processing environment. So you are using both, but at one stage you are using AVRO, at another stage you are using Parquet format in order to optimize the storage plus optimize the cost and performance, because nowadays it is not just data warehouse, there are capabilities and tools which allows you to access these file formats or raw data directly. So you have to keep those considerations in mind so that you don't end up using just one file format, whether AVRO or Parquet, but use it wisely. That okay, for raw data, because I'm including all the columns, this one is better, and then Parquet I will use it just before or after the pre-processing for analytics, because all fields are not required when people are going to query it, or machine learning engineers or data engineers or data scientists are going to query it. So it really depends from one use case to another, but at a large data at a scale level, this makes a lot of sense. I guess this is it from my side. I hope you like the approach, and I'm sure that you go back to your environment and you are going to think differently when it comes to different file format, and this will be useful exercise for you guys as well. Have a great day. Thank you very much. Bye.